All right. We're going to turn it over to Evan, who's going to tell us if Washington, D.C. is a third world city.
Hey everyone, wonderful to be with you. I actually wanted to start off by asking you all, is Washington, D.C. a third world city? So we only have 15 minutes, so I'm not going to attempt to do breakout groups or put anyone else through that ordeal. But I think this is a really important question. My name's Evan, as I've said. I'm a senior research officer at the Refugee Studies Center, University of Oxford. So I work a lot with refugees, migrants, think a lot about geography and bring that into development. And I'm from Seattle, so the other Washington in the States. Does anyone want to answer either your thoughts on that or maybe how you might go about determining that, or a gut answer in one way or another? And I'd love it if you want to shout it out for real, or else feel free to type something into the chat. Ooh. So Romaine says, I guess it comes down to the definitions of third world. Yeah, and if we even want to use that as a definition, right, as a term. Anyone else?
That was my first reaction, but I also guess we might think about like whose perspective in Washington, D.C. are we thinking of, right? I imagine there are like different Washington, D.C.s depending on who you are.
Yeah, right, exactly. So different perspectives for sure. Rachel said geographies of concentrated poverty and wealth within the city. Yeah, marginalities everywhere. If Mexico City is a first world country, at least some parts of it. Yeah. No, thanks for all of these thoughts. I'm nodding my head at all of them. So this is a question that I pose to my students at the very beginning of a class that I teach called Dilemmas of Development. And Oxford has what's called a tutorial system. So it's one-on-one teaching generally, or very small groups, so groups of 2 or 3 students. But this activity could be broadened out to however many students you have in a classroom. And I really try to ask this question for several main reasons. I think it gets right at the core of terminology. And so third world kind of makes me cringe. But what are other people familiar with? What are they using? What do they find problematic? What don't they? So these are kind of some of the background questions that I try to bring more to the forefront. So it gives sort of a terminology, a list to then work with throughout the term. And then also, I guess, yeah, trying to problematize from the beginning our understanding of development and try to get a sense of what students themselves are understanding. So this brilliant question does not come from myself, but comes from a great article that is shared somewhere in the Google folder by Eve Bratman, who wrote an article in 2011 titled this, and says in the abstract, so the article discusses characteristics of third worldality, I don't think I've said that out loud ever, in relation to Washington, D.C. So she finds that despite being emblematic as a power center, the city exhibits many of the characteristics of a third world. So she highlights disenfranchisement, socioeconomic inequality, environmental health issues. And what we find, as many of you already said in the chat, right, is this idea of, quote, underdevelopment, another problematic term, in the heart of the, quote, developed world. So this is one reading that I have a long list of others. One of the others that I really suggest you all look into, because clearly you're interested if you haven't discovered it already, is the Development Dictionary. I find that to be a really core piece of work that does a great job from many different perspectives of kind of deconstructing development. And so I basically aim for students to really think about this. So I have something here that you can read, and this is all in a one-page handout, of trying to understand really students' own definitions of development. And I'd say that one of our former speakers, I think Sabine, talked about decentering, and that being really important. So how do we decenter definitions themselves, and really wanting students to think critically about their own understandings, what terms feel comfortable to them, what don't. And this idea of kind of indicators of how are we measuring it. And I talk about, we have human-centered development, we have GDP, we have, thinking about, political representation or lack thereof. There's a lot to go off of. And Ellie, like you said, whose perspective are we looking at? And that might change the answer. And then really just all about power, right? Who's deciding whose terms, whose world, whose first world, third world exists in which place. So in brief, again, don't try to read this unless you really can. I think you'll have to lean in. But I have students read this list, and then the sort of Oxford tutorial is to write a 1,500-word essay. So just to really answer the essay and have it be an argument. So yes, no, but with nuances, of course. But I'd say as part of this, it really is about trying to let students bring out their own voices and understandings. And I think far too often people are told in defined kind of places and in terms and so on. So other questions that I brought in that have come up really naturally in discussion is just, who created these terms? And that would be where the development dictionary would come in. How do these terms feel? So really kind of somatically, like I really do get a clench in my stomach when I hear third world. So what about others? And then really, what are the other options, right? And like I said, I work with refugees and migrants. So this idea of, the core, periphery, semi-periphery, world systems theory, and kind of thinking about global north, global south. Well, where's Australia in that? Just the kind of absurdity of some of the terms, I think is important to bring out, or to let students share. And I'd say throughout the course, it's this idea of, well, when do you reach development, right? Like, what's the end goal? And so if Washington, D.C. isn't a developed city, then how could it be? So this would all be sort of up for discussion that either could happen in small groups or one-on-one, in my case, often over several sessions. And then as a follow-up assignment, if you have students you might want to sort of push into their own research, then have students come up with their own place to do some research on, and think about maybe ahead of time, what are the indicators that they're choosing? Do they already have a perspective in mind of, does socioeconomic equality matter to them? Does XYZ matter? And kind of doing some research on that. And then that would be an in-class activity either, or a take-home assignment to share. And I'd say, again, I'm kind of repeating myself, but this idea of physical geography, I think really, really matters. And I work with refugees who are on the fringes of Berlin, and like, are they in Germany? Are they in Europe? And I would say they're in actually army barracks, abandoned army barracks. So geography and development, go hand in hand in important ways. And I do end up working with a lot of American students too. And so as an American, as a migrant, I think it's important to kind of go back to the homeland in a sense for some of us, or to really push the boundaries of our scope and who are we looking at, what are we looking at? Let's see, how am I doing on time? I'm struggle to do any sort of back and forth with the chat. I think we're good on time. Let's see, so very briefly, I'll share just a few kind of partial theses that students have come up with, just as a sense of kind of where students have gone with it. So one student, I've gotten permission to share these, said the following essay will address two definitions of development, one which measures economic growth in isolation, and one which measures expansion of socioeconomic arrangements indicating real freedom. So going off of Sen's freedom is development. To prove on both counts, DC shockingly fits a third world assignment, and therefore responsible world powers must reevaluate policy decisions that impact various countries' longevity. So a great mouthful there. And then another student talks about the first, second, third classification of places is not only outdated, but also ethically impermissible. Oops. As it further limits the capabilities of disadvantaged individuals by creating an inferior perception of them. Although there are multitudes of disparities within DC that may suggest its, quote, third worldality, conventional definitions of development would not classify Washington, DC as a third world city. So goes on to argue, actually, things to consider, but doesn't matter in the end. That is a very brief whirlwind tour of this activity. So I will now turn to the chat because I can now sort of focus on that instead of multitasking. But yeah, any questions or comments? And if anyone wants to shout it out too, by all means. And I'll also say that you've also been on a whirlwind visual analysis of the Google search images of Washington, DC. So you will only see pictures of the Capitol if you type this in, and that matters too, right? I searched and was kind of unpleasantly surprised at sort of how it's presented. So questions. Oh gosh, okay. I don't know, does the moderator want to answer? Should I just look? Someone says, I love third world, much preferred to the global south. That's great. And I think, yeah, it's so interesting, right? And there's a great history of third world too, that I think often people don't know about, that can make it feel problematic. And like someone else says, of reasons to maintain third world as a concept. So definitely. And does someone want to share? AJ, do you want to share more about why you like third world as a concept? I'd love to hear it.
Sure.
I'm sure I horribly mispronounced your name as well, so please correct me.
No, not at all. Yeah, I guess, like, you know, as a political project, I think it really speaks to a historical moment in the late 1940s. Sorry, I'm so backlit. The late 1940s into the 1950s, where everybody was getting together to try to prevent recolonization, right? And really important speeches made by you know, political leaders from what we would call, I guess, the South, talking about the need to see colonization as both a left-wing and a right-wing project, which didn't win them any like kind of popularity, but you know, so the idea of reclaiming it as a discursive space to articulate a new vision. But you know, none of this is to detract from anything that you've said, though, because certainly, like, the way that the third world, like everything that you said about Washington D.C. is totally legit. It's just, I don't want to take attention away from that part, but it's just, you know, that project. I think all the issues of lack and discrepancy and stuff totally exist, and it's one of the reasons why the geographic emphasis of the term is unsatisfying in the global South and global North, because it actually doesn't tell us about power. And that's why I think, and somebody cited Mohanty. Mohanty was really right to point out the third world and the first and the first and the third. And, you know, it's actually about the movement of power and domination within states, and the geography is part of the problem, I think, rather than the solution, in my opinion.
Sharing. Yeah, thank you. And exactly, I mean, I think these terms, right, they're kind of loaded in positive, negative ways, and people come to them, right, with really different ideas of what they mean and so on. Thank you for that, for sure. What was I going to say? Oh, Manuel Castells, for anyone, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing his name too, but you know, there's a great chapter about the space of flows that talks about sort of black holes and connectivity, and that's another great resource for students in terms of thinking out kind of the geography of development. Okay, I'm keeping an eye on the time. Let's see here. Oh yeah, there's definitely another interesting debate about who's a migrant and who's an expat. I'd say I will always be a migrant, definitely. And yeah, some other great resources that are here in the chat. I'm just skimming for questions. And again, anyone popcorn style, we have 3 minutes if you want to shout out with thoughts or questions. I'd
say most of the chat is really kind of took off on this discussion of terminology that you really started, right? So someone talked about 2/3, 1/3. Courtney talks about using majority world and minority world. And a couple of people saying, Lindsay said, I love that this exercise lets us interrogate these terms. And it sounds like this presentation has let all of us interrogate these terms too.
Yeah, and I think one thing, maybe just as a takeaway, and then I'll close, is that idea of we have to use something, right? If we want to talk about this, and that doesn't mean we can't still find it problematic, but we do need discourse and we do need language in order, or, you know, there's other ways of expressing as well, right? But I think that's also core to us moving ahead to address some of the problems that might be inherent in development, in the development project and so on. And so there's kind of a necessary evil in a sense of finding something that works, and works either well enough or works with important caveats, and obviously gives discussions unto themselves. So I will close there to not keep anyone from lunchtime or tea time, depending on your, or dinner time, depending on your time zone. Thank you all very much, and I look forward to the rest of the workshop.